What's going on, Warriors? Welcome to another episode of the Mental Health Movement podcast, Voice for the Voiceless. We are officially in the new year, so happy new year to you all. And we are starting a brand new season and a brand new guest. Today, we have a very special guest for our first episode. She is both a doctor of psychology and a licensed marriage and family therapist. She is also the author of the two books, Trauma Recovery Workbook for Teens, and then the book we're covering in today's episode, Gaslighting, a step-by-step recovery guide, Dr. Deborah Vinall. Deborah, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for being on here. It means a lot to get different perspectives. And I remember when I first reached out to you, I was kind of nervous because I was just like, she's very established, and I know some people are kind of iffy about getting on the show. So I greatly appreciated that you're on here.
I'm glad we could make it work out.
Yeah. So before we dig into the book a little bit, so I saw that you were originally from Canada. How did you end up in Southern California?
Oh, well, I first came down for a summer job in between after my first year of college, and ended up falling in love, and so I ended up coming back later and just sort of built a life here.
What college did you attend again?
Originally, I was going to school up in Canada in Vancouver, and then I didn't go back actually and finish my degree at the time because of different funding and different reasons like that. But I went on to complete my degrees here in California.
Nice.
Yeah.
How was the culture compared to Canada? Like, was it a huge culture shock, or is it just kind of like a little difference?
That's an interesting question I reflect on a lot because I feel like the culture in the United States, in my experience, which could be wrong, but feels that it's shifting a lot. So right now I feel like my experience of American culture is quite different from what I grew up with, and I don't think I noticed it as strongly at first, which is kind
Yeah.
of the opposite of how it usually goes for somebody who immigrates between countries.
Right. Yeah. Over the last, like, I'd probably say 5-10 years, it's crazy because I have two younger siblings. So when I talk to them about the stuff that I went through, they just kind of look at me like I'm crazy. It's just like it's hard to relate to them in a lot of subjects because like how I dealt with things isn't how anybody in society deals with things anymore. It's just kind of like, yeah, we don't do that anymore. We do things in a little more healthy way.
They're quite a
And
bit younger than you.
yeah, so I can only imagine how much of a culture shock that was for you.
Yeah.
Um, so what inspired you to get into this line of work with the mental health community?
Well, I started working with adolescents in my early 20s. I wasn't far removed from it myself, probably because I had had my own difficult adolescence and just, my heart was there. But then one of the youth that I was working with was just really in a hard place. A very nearly lethal suicide attempt and in some very dangerous relationships, and I realized like I was way out of my depth. I had no idea, besides like I just came there with a big heart, and I realized it wasn't really, it was big but it wasn't enough. And so that pushed me to start looking into taking classes in like crisis counseling and adolescent psychology. And I loved it. It wasn't, all of these biases I had had against psychology, as I thought it was just like a way for people to manipulate you. um, I thought, well, actually, this can really be helpful, and that kind of ignited a passion in me. And so then I went back to school. Like I said, I'd only done the 1 year of college before that, and I was studying theater at the time, actually. So I went back and studied psychology and uh, marriage, family, child therapy, human development, and those degrees, and moved into this field.
That's incredible. It's amazing. A lot of the people that I talk to, including my own therapist, has had experience in the crisis counseling. Like it's always interesting to hear where they started at versus where they are now. So it's always nice to see most people in this field start out with like younger kids. And I always try to preach this message in my podcast. A lot of people don't realize what it means to be there for somebody until you actually have to be there. And when somebody's kind of at like that crisis level, it's just really eye-opening. It's like, I want to help you, but I don't have the tools and I
Yeah.
don't know how to help you without saying, call this number, and that was me when I was a kid. I didn't have all these resources for me. I struggled a lot with depression and unfortunate attempts. But fast forwarding to now, it's incredible to see so many people that are willing to put their heart and soul into this kind of line of work, because it takes a really strong person to do this kind of work. So I've had experience with a crisis counseling myself, so it's really cool to see where you're at now versus where you started.
It's the same through line from no matter what education I have, that, I truly believe people matter. Every life matters so much. And I want people to know that, to know their worth. And, whether that's volunteering at a youth agency or working as a psychologist, like it's the same through line that drives me.
Right. Yeah, and it's always really nice to see people that are higher up on that I guess totem pole, that stay humble, that realize, like, it doesn't matter how much schooling I've done, it doesn't matter what I've done. What matters is I'm doing this to help you. What can I do to support you, and what can I do to be there for you? So it's nice to see somebody such as yourself who has accomplished as much as you have, and still be able to preach the message that you've sought out to spread to everybody since day one. So that's really cool to see.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to kind of bounce off of that question, how did that lead to writing a book?
Well, honestly, I've always wanted to write since I was, middle school aged. It was a passion and a direction I thought I might go in, but I probably lacked some of the self-discipline to just get started. So it was always a bit of a dream. And I was actually approached by my publisher to see, based on my experience and the work that I did, if I would be interested in writing a book, which of course I was. It was a dream come true for me. So that's actually how that got started, kind of an unusual path.
And what did that process look like for you? Like, about how long did it take to publish your first book?
Well, I had some pretty tight deadlines. And that's why I said, like, the motivation piece came from the outside. And then it was like, okay, get this chapter done by this day. And this is when we're going to start to edit. So I had to, I guess it was a good learning process for me that way. So the whole process probably was about 8 or so months. Yeah, I came
Really?
together pretty quickly. Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's a short amount of time too.
Well, yeah, I know for sure. It was really rapid, but I did have like great support from my editors, and yeah, that really helped too, to have a turnaround.
And just to clarify, because I think I might have my dates mixed around, you had the Gaslighting book out first, right?
Yeah, that
It was
came out in 2021 in spring. So I started that in 2020, which is probably part of the timing there. Is, it was the pandemic and we were just staying home and no weekend plans. So I just wrote every day, and that helped to get it out. So
yeah, when the pandemic first happened, I started my mental health group like 2019, like the very end of 2019. And my initial, I didn't really have long-term goals for it. It was just kind of, I want to save space for myself and others that don't feel like sharing, out there in the open, because social media, as you know, is a very dangerous place. It's a lot of people always trying to out each other. And, so I wanted to create this private group and didn't have any long-term plans. So as that group grew to 1,000, and we're almost at 1,600 people now, 3 years later, it's incredible to see how many people are willing to come together and try and push that same message that you or I are trying to preach. And then the podcast was born during the pandemic. I had no idea what I was doing when I did my first podcast. I go back and listen to the first one, and it's just like, it doesn't sound like the same person. It was only a year ago.
mm-hmm.
And the pandemic, like you said, taught you a lot of discipline, a lot of time management, and you want to get things done by a set date. Because if you don't set a date for yourself, it's like, oh, well, I can do it later. I can do it later.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
For both books, would you say it took about the same time, like about 8 months each?
Probably. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The trauma recovery workbook is like as the title suggests, a workbook, and so it has a lot more exercises. So there's probably a lower word count, but they're about the same size. Um, but yeah, I think it took about the same long or so.
That's one thing I think was incredible about your book was the little exercises that you added in like every chapter. Just kind of like put yourself in this situation or close your eyes and envision this in your safe space and everything. I think I wish more books with this, like line of like this subject would do the same, just kind of instead of just all words. Because I struggle myself getting through books just because, that was a really bad habit of mine in high school. Is just like, yeah, I'll just read a chapter and then just kind of, I guess guess my way through a book report kind of thing.
Mhm.
And now that I'm older and trying to, push through this path in the mental health field, um, being able to see that there's like exercises and then there's little breathing uh pauses there too helps people like me because my attention span is so bad. It's terrible. But
Well, I wanted to
yeah,
make it really practical because, I love doing what I do, being able to sit with people and work through their trauma and their work with them. But I know there are so many people who can never access therapy. And so that was one of the driving motivators for me in writing these books is to reach the people who maybe can afford to buy like a $15 book, but can't afford therapy from week to week or don't have access to it with insurance or whatever. So I really wanted to make it practical and instill some of the exercises that maybe we might do if we were sitting together to
right.
really bring it home and not just let it be a cerebral thought process.
Yeah. One of the biggest things for me is trying to preach to everybody that therapy is not for everybody. A lot of people struggle with just like the thought of therapy. It's like I don't want to tell somebody about my feelings, and then just how does that make you feel? And that's such a common misconception of therapy, right? And um I just feel there's so much information on both the internet and these books that just kind of sit there because either social media has us trained to just scroll, right, and we're not reading things.
Yeah.
So that was one of the biggest things that I brought up to my therapist. It's like, every episode that I put out that doesn't have a guest, it's just kind of like I'm getting this information off the internet and I'm making a podcast about it and just kind of putting my personal story into it. Because I know a lot of people from my generation, I'm 30, so I know there's a lot of people in my age group that won't go out of their way to read a book or look up a website on resources and stuff. So putting like the exercises and stuff in books like this definitely help people like me a lot. So again, greatly appreciated that you did that.
Great. Thank you for that.
So, just one more question before we dig into the book. I want to acknowledge the reward that you received because I thought it was very powerful when I read what the award was for. So it was the Sandra Wilson Memorial Grant, right? That was the actual award from the EMDR Research Foundation. And you covered mass shootings across the US. And I'm sure that was a very hard subject to dig into. So, what did that process look like for you, I guess, pursuing that award or grant?
Well, I had kind of fallen into that work. It became an accidental subspecialty when I live in Southern California, and there was about 6 years ago, there was a terrorist attack on December 2nd in San Bernardino that killed 14 people. And I ended up with a contract with the county that was um, helping to pay for their therapy. And so I saw a lot of survivors from that attack. And then subsequently, there was the big infamous Route 90, the Las Vegas mass shooting at the concert. Uh, and so I ended up with some more people coming to me from that, since a lot of Southern Californians go to Vegas for their concerts on the weekend. And then there was the one in Borderline Bar and Grill in Thousand Oaks, California, which is a bit further from me, but nevertheless, because those were college students are from different places, and I ended up with some contact with survivors from that as well. And so it kind of snowballed in that I started to have this subspecialty within trauma that I never anticipated having. And as I worked with these survivors from different types of shootings, different environments, I started to notice there were some patterns that they exhibited in their symptomology that were consistent and yet somewhat different from what we expect with other traumas. And so that got me curious, and also wanting to perhaps share what I'm observing with other clinicians who might work with other survivors of these shootings, because unfortunately, they're happening repeatedly all across the country. And if we're not going to stop it, we at least should know how to respond, um, unfortunately. So I started doing some research with that, and I reached out to clinicians across the country through different networks. Because I was doing a lot of EMDR at the time, I wanted to, and I'd seen some people who came to me who had from other things that happened a long time ago and hadn't received that kind of therapy. There was a real difference in their response as well. So I really wanted to compare and contrast different therapy approach with EMDR because I was seeing how effective that was. Um, and yeah, so I reached out to clinicians across the country who had helped survivors from any of these any mass shootings that we have, we're all quite familiar with on the news, from Sandy Hook to Newton, school shootings, community shootings, theaters. Like, there's so many environments, and we're unfortunately quite familiar with them. So yeah, so collecting the stories through the clinicians. So it was an interview process where I'm asking questions on certain topics and gathering that information and compiling themes, where the same things were consistent or different around different things like the symptom presentation and the impacts on social spheres, on spirituality. Yeah, a lot of different things like that. And so that's what that was for.
So and you had therapy sessions with the survivors, you said, right? Like,
Yeah, with those several different ones, but
yeah,
the research was from talking to people across the entire
to the
country.
clinicians,
What
right?
catapulted me into wanting to explore this further.
Right. And the survivors that that you did speak to, was it ever in like a group setting, or is it just kind of like one on one? Because I know sometimes, if I'm assuming, because I'm not really familiar with like how group therapy works, but I would assume something like that traumatic would have to be a one on one kind of session, right?
I do one-on-one therapy.
Yeah.
I know that at different shootings, and in particular in San Bernardino, there were some group things provided. Most of the survivors didn't find that particularly helpful because it could be so triggering to be hearing everybody else sharing the story, or because they would hold back out of fear of triggering other people. So
Yeah, no, that definitely makes a lot of sense. I had somebody who had a borderline personality disorder, and she was suggested to do group therapy. And when she initially told me about it, my first thought of group therapy was just kind of what you were saying. You don't want to trigger other people with your stories, and you hold back a lot of feelings. So I couldn't imagine somebody with a disorder like that sharing their story and what they face every day, and not trigger anybody off of like what they truly feel. Like, how much of, I would assume you're only putting half of yourself out there for a group therapy environment. So I guess my question for you is, do you think that group therapy is effective? Like, I guess, in what situation would it be effective?
that's a great question. It's been a number of years since I've done any group therapy. When I worked in a residential setting, that was part of the program. Um, And those are, because for those reasons that you mentioned, that those are definitely valid reasons people hold back. But it can be positive in that group therapy can make people realize that they're not alone, that they're not the only one who experiences something. It may not be ideal as a first immediate response after a trauma, or as they're beginning a therapeutic process. Uh, but it can be helpful, especially with some more ongoing chronic things where there's also an individual component. We're all pretty familiar with the AA model, which isn't necessarily therapy, but kind of is. Um, that there's an accountability process and a like-mindedness of holding each other in that same space, and knowing that, again, yeah, you're not alone. You're not the only one who struggles, because that's a big thing that comes up with trauma, whether it's a shooting or an assault or child abuse. There's a sense of, I'm the only one and I'm different because of it, and I can't relate to the rest of the world because I'm stigmatized in some way. Um, and that's often a really profound lie uh, that serves to worsen the effects of the trauma by isolating you. And so that is actually a really important thing if it can provide that sense of solidarity with others and recognition that you're
Right.
not alone. Others
Yeah,
in.
no, that makes a lot of sense. Like I said, I guess just kind of thinking about group therapy, just like off the top of my head, I wouldn't feel personally comfortable in a group setting just because I guess sharing my personal story, I know it can help people, but at the same time, I would feel like somebody's comparing their trauma to mine and just kind of like unintentionally making it a competition because I have experienced that before.
Yeah, that's
So,
healthy.
and I know that's one of the things that we'll get into about your book, and I believe that's called scaling, right?
Hmm. Yeah, where you're
Okay,
comparing traumas against each other. I
right.
think, just to conclude on this idea about group therapy, I think the best ones are probably where the focus is on things like coping skills and management of your depression, your anxiety, and rather than the traumas that are underneath it, and to leave that in an individual setting where you can really process through it without fear of holding back or hurting somebody else.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a phrase in here that I wrote down that I actually took me back. In a really positive way because I was always taught, whatever I've gone through, just create those distractions for yourself. Just get through whatever you're going through and have all those distractions around you. One of the things that you put in there was feel your feelings, feel the void.
Yeah.
Those three words, feel the void, blew me away
Mm,
because the way that you put it, just like instead of replacing that void with something temporary, instead of just kind of looking for the next big thing to keep you on the high instead of staying down here. And you were saying stay down here until you can stand back up.
yeah.
I love that.
Mm.
I gotta know where where did that come from? Because oh my God.
Hmm. Oh gosh, I don't know, where does it originally come from? Uh, I don't know. A lot of therapy theorists, my own experience in walking through my own valleys. The truth is, that's what a lot of addiction is, right? Is that avoidance, that not wanting to feel it. And when that pain is there and we just try to stuff it down, we're going to end up in an unhealthy place. When we can walk through those valleys and feel that hurt and that pain, it's kind of like if you ever waded out into a cold lake or ocean. It's cold at first and it's shocking, right? But if you stay for a few moments, it doesn't feel as cold anymore, right?
Right.
Nothing is stagnant. No feeling is stagnant. And we're so afraid of feeling the pain that we run from it. But if the pain isn't, I mean, you don't touch a hot stove, right? But cold water doesn't hurt you. Like, if it's not going to completely break you, let yourself feel it, and the discomfort will dissipate and you will build strength and find that you can move through it. And that's where healing comes in.
That is just absolutely phenomenal. When I read that last part, I was just like, I have to bring this up in the podcast because I think that is one of the best phrases I think I've ever heard. Because, like you said, stuffing down your trauma and not feeling what you want to feel, and just kind of like, I'll watch a movie all day or I'll do this all day just to keep my mind busy. But meanwhile, all that trauma is just sitting there simmering and then
Yeah.
eventually it just explodes.
Yeah,
So,
underneath you're still unhappy, and like you said, explode. Sometimes it comes out as anger, comes out as depression. It does come out because we can't just make it go away by ignoring it. It's still there.
right. Yeah. And that's one of the biggest things I try to tell people if they ever come to me for help. It's just like, I know you're struggling and I want you to know that you're not alone, but you also got to allow yourself to feel what you're feeling.
Yeah.
I always encourage people to try and cope with, however they can cope. But if you're like, especially during grief, because I'm sure, as you know, if you lose anybody, whether it's somebody loses their life or a friend or anything cuts ties with you or whatever, grief is one of the most powerful feelings that anybody can feel. And I feel like if you don't feel that loss and you don't acknowledge that those feelings are there, it's just going to sit there till it gets worse and it gets worse, you know?
It'll stay waiting for you.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
read through it. Yeah.
Right.
And sometimes, if you've grown up with this without permission to feel your feelings and emote and express them, that gets deeply internalized. It's, as an unwritten rule, it's not okay to feel. It's not okay to express my feelings. And that's garbage messaging that hurt you then and is hurting you now. And
Yeah.
so that's something to really critically examine and maybe release so that you can heal now.
Right. And that was a message that was kind of given to me growing up, was just kind of, you're a man, you got to be a man, and men don't express their feelings, kind of thing. So, you know, back to what I was saying earlier about where we've come from to where we are now is phenomenal, because reading things like feeling the void, I wouldn't have heard that when I was 14. I would have just heard from my parents, oh well, stop being upset, it's just a relationship, or it's just this, or it's just that.
Yeah.
And reading that, I want to say had a massive impact on my heart, like, honest to God, incredible. So for anybody who needs to hear it again, feel the void, and healing will come, one day at a time. That's one thing I always try to preach as well, one day at a time. And progress, not perfection. A step is still a step, no matter how big and how small it is.
Absolutely.
And there's one more phrase that I wrote down, that another one that just kind of blew me away, was boundary setting is not a negotiation.
Mm-hmm.
Mind blown. I When I read that, I smiled so big, like I am like an idiot, but um boundaries are something that were very foreign to me growing up. I never was able to put up boundaries with my parents, just kind of growing up in a emotionally abusive household.
Yeah.
And boundaries weren't something that I knew of until I started therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And when you learn to put up those boundaries and you're able to start healing, like I believe one of the stories that you shared towards the end of the book was somebody didn't want to go to, like, I think it was a holiday party because of a narcissistic parent, I believe it was, and their whole family just trying to gaslight her, saying that, oh, you're over exaggerating or whatever. And then her response was, all right, she didn't respond until the next month. I'm like, wow, it really is incredible to see how powerful a boundary truly can be for somebody.
Yeah, people who want to control you and families that want to control you aren't going to teach you boundaries. And so you show up in adulthood without any sense of that, and it can hurt you in so many dynamics, from work to friendships to dating and on and on. And so it's such a powerful thing when you realize that you have the right to boundaries. You can create boundaries that are healthy for you and you can enforce them.
Yeah, and just to kind of add to my message of my age group of, like, the boundaries conversation, I had people about the same age as me who kind of sort of dealt with what they did with my parents and with their parents. And I told them, I said, you got to put up boundaries. So what are boundaries? I don't know what boundaries are. Like, if you really think about it, like, boundaries are something that'll change your life, and they absolutely changed my life. Like, I don't think I would have been able to do this podcast or been able to do therapy or any of that without boundaries. And when you're able to start putting up those boundaries, you can start taking care of yourself, whether it's mentally, physically, and emotionally.
Yeah, boundaries are rooted in some amount. You have to have a seed of self-love,
Yeah.
right? If you can respect yourself enough that your needs matter, then you construct boundaries to protect those. And so then a boundary allows you to love yourself and others at the same time. So it doesn't have to become one or the other.
Yeah, and I absolutely want to highlight that word self-love, because that's something I feel so many struggle with. It's hard to tell yourself that you love yourself when you're struggling.
Yeah,
And
you feel worthless.
there's there's a little activity that my therapist came up with for me. It's called the compassionate observer.
Mhm.
Basically, what it is you're talking in two perspectives. You're talking from your, whatever negative emotion you're feeling, and then you try to reply to it with like the logical side of you. And I always try to end every single one with "I love you." When I
Wow.
wrote that first one, my therapist just kind of dropped her jaw, and she, like, I would have never expected, like, you did really really good for that activity. So
That's amazing. It gives me chills. I love that.
yeah, and when you're able to look in the mirror and tell yourself that I love you, it's powerful.
Yeah.
Self-love is something I didn't have probably 99% of my life, because I was, just grew up around narcissistic parents.
And if
And
you're taught that you're not worthy of love, you will not learn to love yourself. But that's
absolutely.
always a lie. That's always a lie. Every child is worthy of love, and every one of us adults is just an overgrown child.
Right. Yeah, and honoring your inner child is another really powerful phrase that I've learned too. It's something I never really understood when people said that, I guess, if I've ever heard it throughout my life. When I started understanding what that meant, and again, boundaries,
Mm.
um, it helped you, hug that inner child that was been battered and bruised your whole entire life, and you start feeling that inner peace within yourself.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the book. Okay. So my first question about the book: do you feel that narcissists purposely target more people with mental illness in order to remain in control and use those tools of manipulation and gaslighting?
Largely.
Yeah.
Um, Somebody like that, a gaslighter is somebody who wants to have control of others. And it's easiest to control somebody when you see a weakness or a need, something that your target is missing. So very often that's going to be there's going to be some mental illness, there's going to be unmet childhood needs, a need for love, a need for family, um, a need for self-love, like we were just talking about. So very often you're going to find that will be somebody with mental illness. And also, if it doesn't stick, they're going to move on quickly, right? A gaslighter wants to be in control. And so if they start putting their attentions on somebody who's just like not interested in that kind of dynamic, they'll shift because they want to have the feeling of power. And so if you've grown up in a dynamic where this kind of gaslighting and things like that and control have been present, it won't feel so unfamiliar or as wrong as it should feel. It'll feel normal. And so you're more likely to stay in that dynamic with the gaslighter. So there's kind of a marriage, a meeting of those two dynamics.
So essentially, it's kind of that revolving door or cycle, if you will, of just constantly being gaslit or just being aware of what a narcissist is, but it's your normal. It's what you're quote unquote used to seeing. So it's just kind of hard to break out of that cycle.
Right. Most gaslighters are very charming and can present this really amazing outside layer, but there's always red flags. But if you're not really familiar with a really healthy relationship, it's going to be hard to identify the red flags for being red flags and to be able to contrast that with what healthy looks like. So you're more likely to stick around and continue to be psychologically abused and manipulated.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you said that they're charming, because it's definitely something I've noticed with my mom more specifically. I remember the first time I started like noticing the things that she was doing to me. I think I was like maybe early 20s, and I was talking to a friend about what was going on. Oh, your mom, she seems so sweet. She wouldn't do anything like that. And
Yeah.
I don't think my friend was trying to like stick up for my mom or anything. I guess it was just kind of a they didn't see it for themselves, so it didn't happen kind of thing.
Right.
And when those red flags started becoming like more and more common, and realizing like I got to get out of this situation as soon as possible, most people don't even have that option of getting out,
It's
and
so hard to get out because gaslighters are savvy. So they cultivate this world where that charm is very present. An impulsive, abusive, explosive person, that person others might see. like, oh, yeah, they're really out of control and this is unhealthy. But a gaslighter is that insidious, savvy person who's doing mind games with you. They're in enough control of themselves most of the time that they can present a whole different view to the outside world, which isolates you so that when you want to get out, other people don't see it. They don't support you or encourage you or even offer you that safe place that you need to go.
One thing that I always found pretty amazing was, like you were saying, when it doesn't stick and they start to shift away from, I guess, not being able to gaslight you or whoever else is going through that, and they move on to somebody else. When I started my healing journey, when I was first in New Jersey, was my first therapist. Um, I was only with her for 3 months, and that 3 months completely like opened my eyes to like everything around me. When I was starting to be able to call out my mom of the things that she was doing, and she didn't, she didn't like that. She was just like, "Oh well, I didn't say that. You're making that up." Like just an attempt to like kind of
Yeah,
push you back, like you're imagining things.
defensive gaslighting.
Right. Yeah. And when I made the decision to move back down here to Florida, she realized that she doesn't have me under her thumb anymore. And the healing started coming because she couldn't hurt me anymore.
You were safe at last.
Yeah. And breaking that cycle of just being constantly told that nobody cares about you, or you're as bad as this person, or XYZ, you're making all this story up.
Yeah.
And when you
Oh,
bring up things to them, they just, oh, well, leave it in the past kind of thing, like it never happened.
no responsibility taking. Yeah, you're
Yeah.
describing very classic
Yeah.
gaslighting behaviors. Hmm.
It's incredible what happens when healing starts, because you start to realize so much, you know.
Yeah.
Um, so this is actually a question, because you had listed different types of personalities in your book, and it's always kind of something I've wondered how the process works. So you have from like antisocial personality disorder to anywhere to borderline personality disorder. How do you determine what kind of personality someone may struggle from?
So for me, those are diagnostic categories. The antisocial personality disorder, which is somebody who's quite sociopathic, enjoys cruelty toward others. A narcissistic personality disorder, the person who really just craves adoration and accolades and being the spotlight and will be quite cruel because they only really care about themselves. The borderline personality disorder, somebody who's quite impulsive in their relationships. They're very volatile. And they'll do whatever serves in the moment in order to meet their needs for attachment, but in a very unhealthy way. So those are generally diagnostic categories, and I think I mentioned them in my book to kind of give a framework that a lot of times um, gaslighters have this kind of pathology, and the point of that is just to identify that as much as they try to say there's something wrong with you, you're mentally ill, although you may end up with mental illness thanks to all the abuse you've suffered, but they often will point to you and say, you're the problem, you've got mental illness. If you weren't so broken, I wouldn't have to, all that kind of stuff. The truth of the matter is, these behaviors come from this personality pathology. They're not well. And so I write about that to really encourage the reader to understand, like, you're not the problem.
Right.
So it's not as important for the average person to figure out, like, what exactly kind of disorder do I think my parent, my ex, my whatever has, but to just really understand, like, it's not about you.
Right. Yeah, no, that definitely, putting it in that perspective definitely makes a lot more sense, because whenever I first read it, it was just kind of one of those questions I wrote down, because I guess I never really understood like the disorder portion of the mental illness category. Like I know what they are, but
Mhm.
like I guess I never really understood how exactly one determines what somebody is suffering from. But the way that you put it makes a lot more sense for sure.
Yeah, I think there's a reason that clinicians need to get a handle on it, as far as if you're treating somebody who shows up with these symptoms, then having an understanding of what you're dealing with can guide how to help the person. Um, but in general, what matters most to the average person and in your healing is, how did this person impact you?
Right.
And
Yeah.
trust yourself about that. That what
Yeah,
you're
and the message of it's not you, it's just what that disorder is, but also doesn't excuse how they treat you as well. So yeah.
absolutely, yes. Thank you for saying that. That's really important.
Yeah, one of the biggest things I struggled with my mom was I was always told that, she suffered from, bipolar, she had depression, she had, health issues. And I remember when I first started therapy and first started struggling really bad with my mom, because when I started therapy, she didn't like that I was starting to break away from her and becoming my own person.
Yeah.
And I remember a family member, I believe it was my aunt, was saying, "Oh, well, she's not mentally well, and she's doing all this because such and such." Didn't like say it's not your fault that she's treating you that way. It's just, she's just not well. And it was just kind of cut off there. So I guess that was the only reason I had to add the part in there, was it's important to note that the people that are mentally ill, while yes, it's unfortunate that they're going through that, uh, oh, wait, I think my video is messing up. Sorry. Okay. Sorry about that. But it's also important to note that uh, it doesn't excuse how you're being treated, and your feelings are absolutely valid,
100%. It can sometimes help to contextualize your experience when it's very easy for a child, especially, to blame themselves and to say, like, what did I do that my parent um, abused me this way, neglected me, didn't care, called me these things? Like, what's wrong with me that they were not the parent I needed to be? And it's so important to even if we understand, like, there was mental illness involved, it wasn't about you. That doesn't
Right.
take away at all from the fact that you didn't get what you needed and you were hurt in ways that you never deserved to be hurt.
Yeah, definitely. The next question I had for you was, um, with the different kinds of gaslighters listed in your book, is there one that I guess is most common, or is it just kind of like situational? Or
Yeah, so I talked about the sadistic gaslighter, which would be the really cruel one who just takes delight in playing mind games with you. That's probably your least common one, but it is definitely a very damaging one. And so there's almost a reverse order, I think, in that. So I talk about the sadistic, the narcissistic gaslighter, the defensive, insecure gaslighter, and then the accidental gaslighter, which isn't really gaslighting, but is worth mentioning because you may have that experience of feeling gaslit by somebody who really just has memory issues. Um, and so the most damaging is probably the least common, and the most common might be the least damaging in their effect because of the intention of it, right? If
right,
somebody's intending to be cruel, it's going to hurt even more than somebody who is trying to protect themselves. So I would say that probably the most common is that defensive, insecure. The narcissistic gaslighter is unfortunately too common and causes a lot of damage. Um, and so it's kind of in that sweet spot of getting a lot of attention because it's common enough that it resonates with a number of people, but it's extraordinarily damaging. But I don't want to say that there is gaslighting that isn't damaging. Even when
yeah,
it's like that accidental thing, it can kind of be a bit of a mind trip. But that defensive, insecure kind of behavior is also quite damaging because, again, it's centering the other person. And healthy relationships happen when we it's centering themselves. A healthy relationship happens when we center the other person as well as ourselves. Like, we have our boundaries, but we reach out with care and concern and love for the other person.
right. Yeah, no, the narcissist gaslighter definitely is something I feel I've experienced my whole life. And I wasn't sure if the other ones listed were more common, but um yeah, it's unfortunate to see that be so common, because it, like you said, gaslighting, no matter if it's accidental or if it's the sadistic, it affects you in one way or another. And a lot of people don't realize how bad words hurt
Mhm.
until it happens. Like the old saying, words cut like a knife. And it's true. Because I feel like so many parents do it to their kids.
Yeah.
And I've seen it, aside from my own experience, I've seen it from my friends' parents. Like,
Mhm.
it's something I wish my parents' generation had a lid on before they had kids, because I feel like, again, back to the cycle, it just kept going and got worse and got worse, you
Yeah.
know.
I think that's one thing that's kind of nice about this younger generation waiting longer to have kids. It might be because of economics or whatever other reasons, but it gives us time to stop and pause and reflect and heal before we pass it on to the next generation if having children is part of your life plan or works out.
I absolutely agree. Being 30, I did a podcast, I think maybe 3 episodes ago about social norms, about how, people my age, if they don't have kids, it's like, my time is running out. I got to have this by this age. I got to have this by that age. And like you were saying, the younger generation is kind of smashing that social norm where it's just like, either it's not emotionally feasible for me to have kids or just not financially ready for those kids. Because I grew up with really young parents. And while they were growing up and finding themselves, they were trying to raise me. And, again, not to excuse their behavior and how I was treated, but, they grew up with a system that was broken too.
Yeah.
And while we have resources now and we're preaching the message more than we have in the last 20 years, there's still so much ground to cover, and so many cycles that are still continuing. But,
Yeah.
subjects like gaslighting, it becoming a word that is becoming more common, and people being able to identify of how toxic a certain relationship may be and free themselves and be able to start healing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So to kind of add to that question, would you consider comparing traumas a form of gaslighting?
That's an interesting question. I guess it depends how it's used. So a gaslighter, I could very much see doing that. Like your whatever you went through isn't so bad. Your brother went through this, or you're not as bad as this other group. So it's used in that way to diminish your pain and to deflect away from it, which is a pretty classic gaslighter move. Um, Often people compare their own traumas, and you can't really gaslight yourself because you're not trying to control yourself in that way. But that's also a really damaging thing. Um, when people, I so often have people come into the therapy office and say, well, I didn't go through this or that, so I really shouldn't, feel my feelings, work through the therapy. Like I don't have a right to be here and heal is basically what they're saying, because no matter what they've been through, it's like some of the most horrific things I've ever heard. And they're like, yeah, but it wasn't as bad as X. I'm like, oh my goodness, can we just all heal? You don't
Yeah.
have to. And maybe that's because that's been a message, right? There's such profound effects of that. Your feelings don't matter because they're not as bad as so and so. That doesn't matter. What matters is what you feel, how you've experienced something, whether it was intentional, accidental, sadistic. If you've been hurt, you're allowed to feel the hurt and to move through that.
Right. And just to kind of add to the feel your feelings part of, I've experienced a lot of traumas being compared. It's just like, oh, well, you got emotionally abused. At least you didn't get this, this, and this happen. It's like, listen, I may not have been this kind of abused, but it still affected me in a way where I'm going to therapy and I'm trying to heal myself.
Yeah.
So your feelings are valid, my feelings are valid.
Mhm.
And that whenever the group first formed, and I think people were kind of stuck in that social media mentality where, oh, well, you didn't have this happen to you, so what you're talking about doesn't matter kind of thing. And I had to express to them, like, listen, I've gone through more than I care to talk about sometimes, and I shared my story in an attempt to help somebody, not to diminish what anybody else has gone through. So if you're going to share your story, share your story. This is a safe space. But
Mhm.
if you're going to share your story, don't diminish what your sister went through. Don't diminish what your best friend went through. Your feelings are your own. And, like you said, feel your feelings and validate yourself and validate others, quite frankly.
Yeah. And as you said, you're recognizing, like, I went through this really painful thing and I didn't go through that. You can even have a little bit of space for gratitude that you didn't also experience that, without diminishing that. Emotional abuse is incredibly damaging because it's attacking the core of who you are as you're developing as a human being. That's really, really problematic. And if we aren't willing to face that, unless it's tacked on with some other abuse, we cripple society at large.
Yeah, I remember when my parents first started telling me that I can open up to them and everything else. And I guess I didn't know how to express myself properly without telling them what I was having trouble with. Now that I'm older and I can have a conversation with them and know my wording and everything else and how to talk to them, um, I limit what I say to both of them because I know what kind of people they are.
Mhm.
When I was younger, it was just, oh well, it's not that bad. Your childhood wasn't that bad, and I did my best. And again, diminishing and just kind of devalidating anything that I was feeling. You want me to tell you what's going on, I'm telling you. And now that I'm expressing myself, it means nothing. That's pretty much what they're telling me.
Let me tell you a short little story. Oh, I have a child. Um, and when he was really little, I was having coffee with a friend, and we were talking about, I was telling her, I don't know, remember why, that at one point we had talked about adopting. And I said, I wanted an older child, meaning that we were looking at adopting an older child, right? Well, my little 2-year-old hears that, and he says to me in the sweet, sad little voice, Mama, that hurts my feelings. And I was like, oh my gosh.
No.
He heard me say, I wanted an older kid, not this toddler. So if he hadn't spoken up and said, that hurts my feelings, I never would have had the chance to step in and say, oh, I love you and want you so much. And let me explain what I was talking about and heal that little wound right away. So my point is, intent and wounding can be so different, right? I could have deeply wounded my child at that moment and never meant to be cruel. And so when a parent says, I did my best, that should never undermine the fact that you've been hurt, because those two things can be separate. Even, if they're a great parent or if they're not so great, but, we're doing their best, your wounds are your wounds, and you don't have to apologize for how you feel. You don't have to diminish how you feel. You don't have to avoid working through it because somebody else was doing their best.
Yeah, and isn't it interesting how just bright kids are at a very young age when they notice everything around them and they're expressing things that some adults can't even express at
Right. He
such
was drawing a
young.
picture. I didn't know he was listening.
And it's I've had conversations with little kids that it's things that they shouldn't have seen or heard or just talking about now. And with the age of technology, it's almost impossible to avoid that now. But I've had conversations with 6-year-old kids that I'm like, why are you saying all these things? Like, you're only 6. Why aren't you playing with blocks?
Mhm.
And sorry about that. The video keeps going out. And it's just incredible how much they absorb and how much they express at such a young age. And that little bit of influence from adults around them can just completely shut that down and just like put a lid on it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And, sometimes we think like, oh, well, this happened before a certain age, they won't remember it. But we incorporate those wounds into our psyche, right? And so this story could have ended in a totally different way where I never knew he thought that. He just internalized it. He forgot the moment and just grew up thinking, I'm not wanted and feeling unwanted, and that sets a really deep tone.
Yeah. Where is okay? At what age do you think it's possible for an individual, I guess, to start identifying gaslighting behaviors? Like, is there a specific age or just kind of individual experiences, I guess?
Like as a child, perhaps growing up being gaslit, when do they start? When are you capable of recognizing what's going on?
Mhm.
Yeah, usually not so early, unfortunately, because we're dependent on the adults that are raising us, we tend to put them on a bit of a pedestal. They are godlike, and we are, dependent. And so when things aren't going well in a relationship, we tend to blame ourselves. If dad is yelling, then it's because I'm a bad boy. Or if mom is cruel, it's because I'm not worthy of love, right? And so that can persist for a long time. And sometime during adolescence, it starts to shift. And we start to look at things more objectively, more abstractly. And then maybe, I see young people are so much more psychologically savvy than they've been before, and it's a beautiful thing. Um, sometime in the teen years, I think they're able to recognize, like, if I've got the language for it, I can label it. And that's why I think, one of the purposes of my book too is to create, and I think it's well known now, but to create that language, create that understanding. What is gaslighting? And when you know what it is and you recognize it, then you can see if it's happening in your relationship and you can call it out, even if just internally calling it out. So it's a combination of maturity and, I think, knowing what you're looking for.
Yeah, I was assuming around teenagers too, teenage years as well. That makes a lot of sense considering that's when you start like noticing your emotions and noticing how you're feeling about certain things. So I guess yeah, definitely makes a lot of sense when
Yeah,
your
not
body's
just
shifting.
and not just always trusting your parents. When you're little, like, you trust them. If they tell you that the sky is purple, you're like, oh, I thought it was blue, And so when they tell you that that what you saw is not what really happened, right? Classic gaslighting move. You question yourself, and that does make you feel a little bit crazy, which
Yeah,
is really what gaslighting is and does. That's why
right.
it's so effective.
So this is a question I kind of came up with because of my experience with bullying. Is there a link between gaslighting and bullying at all?
Yeah. I think about that classic, like, the kid is like making you hit yourself, like, stop hitting yourself. Like, that's
Right.
gaslighting, right? Like, I'm not hitting myself.
Interesting.
Right. And also, I think we use that word bullying so much in a child context, but really what it is, parents bully their kids a lot. And that's one way that they do it.
To remain in control.
It's all about controlling somebody else,
Wow, I never thought of that. The hitting yourself thing kind of the wow. That
right?
just it took me back a little bit. That makes a lot of sense. Oh my god. Yeah, I guess I never put two and two together. Like I said, gaslighting was kind of a newer term to me
Mhm.
uh in the last like 2 years or so. So hearing that bullying and that kind of go hand in hand with each other, because I've been bullied by my parents. So that's something, wow. Yeah. Wow, that makes a lot of sense.
Well, and it's like what we were talking about earlier, how these gaslighters look for people where they see some vulnerability or need in them to exploit. So bullies are going to do the same. And so often the people who are bullied are people who are not being treated well at home. Why? Because those bullies, these gaslighters, they look for that vulnerability. There's that need for love that hasn't been fulfilled. So there's a little less confidence. Ah, there's a target.
Wow. That's something. Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you for kind of clarifying that for me, because now that's another thing that blew my mind because I never put two and two together. um so how did the 7 steps come to be for you in this book? Like, was there a process of figuring out these steps, or was it just kind of like you added personal experience into these steps?
Mm. Yeah, it's probably a lot of things coming together as well, as far as like, this is what, you know, I walk people through in different ways without being so formalized in treatment. It's somewhat similar in some ways to like AA, right? Where you've got first you acknowledge you've got a problem and you move forward from there. Like, the first step to changing anything is recognizing that it's an issue and deciding, right? Um, yeah.
Is there any one step that stands out for you? Like, for me personally, I would say the grieving step stands out for me massively because I've lost a lot of friends in the last year, both to passing away and just friendships. Um, so that one really stuck out to me because like I mentioned earlier, the feel the void and feel your feelings uh, came to part. But is there any one step that sticks out to you the most, like that you just like resonate with?
I was going to say the same thing as soon as you asked that, that I think the grief stage stands out the most in my mind, partly because we like to skip that as a society. I mean, whether it's formal grief, somebody dies, you have 3 days off work, now go back to work and we've moved on. Like, really? Where other societies, it's a whole year-long process and we're just, a few days. We try to avoid pain so much in our society. And I think it's important to call that out, that we need to stop and feel it, to count the cost, to have self-compassion, because self-compassion is just the root of healing. And that's why I think that that really stands out the most to me. Grieving, not just like being sad, but allowing yourself to move through that process, to count the cost, to let the feelings show up, let the tears flow, whatever it takes. And in that, you're even starting to love yourself because you're allowing yourself that compassion, right? And from there, everything builds like a layer on top of it. From there, the self-care that you need when you're going through a grieving process,
Right.
right? Um, we've talked a little bit earlier and then just kind of now touching barely on it about avoidance behaviors versus moving through. And then you mentioned something about coping skills. And so I just wanted to like distinguish those two. Avoidance where we're filling ourselves up with something to avoid our feelings, like food or alcohol or drugs, or we're binge watching sometimes. That's the avoidance part. And then the coping skills are ways that we allow ourselves to feel and comfort ourselves at once. So it's not avoiding the feeling. So that can be things like a coping skill can even be allowing yourself to cry. It can be calling a friend. It can be writing a journal. It can be all kinds of sensory things that are comforting to you, like wrapping yourself in a warm blanket and having a cup of tea, taking a warm bath. But it's where you allow move through with comfort.
Yeah, and I think to me, I feel like the grieving process is where most of the healing happens. I feel, like you said, when you start feeling everything and you start acknowledging that, you lost this person or you lost this friendship or you lost this relationship, and then you start discovering who you are as a person and what voids in your life that you need to feel and heal from at the same time. So I think it's the most powerful of stages, just in general. The grief process is, like you said, a lot of people avoid pain.
Mhm.
And I think the healthiest way is to embrace pain. You
Yeah.
know, it's really hard to swallow that pill, but grief is something that is essential in life. It's
Mm.
just a part of the life cycle, whether it's somebody passing on, whether it's new people coming into your life after others left. You always have to welcome in change. And a lot of people don't like that change. And like you said, the avoidance behavior.
Mhm. It's unpleasant and it's so painful. But if we stuff it down, we deaden all of our feelings. If we don't
Right.
allow ourselves to feel the hurt, we can't feel joy ever again. So, and yeah, so like that grief stage within the stages. So, like, just for your listeners to recount them, the first is like um, acknowledging it, recognizing what it is, and accepting that it's happening, and then grief, allowing yourself to grieve all of the things that this gaslighting has taken from you, relationships, things you've given up, things associated with that. And then everything else builds from there. So that's the valley, and then it starts to go back up again. And that's the important thing about grief is, and feeling your feelings, is trusting that it's the bottom of the valley. It's not where you stay. And from there, we layer on the next step um, is taking care of yourself, focusing on yourself, building things into your life that maybe you've never been able to when you're in a relationship with this gaslighting, controlling person. Setting boundaries that allow you to, take up space in the world and build relationships that you want. um, Making decisions about the people in your life, such as, and that's kind of connected to boundaries, but like, who are you going to let close and how close are you going to let them and how are you going to spend your time? And then even reaching out and building new, healthy relationships with people that will treat you as you deserve to be treated.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said that any better. That was incredible. At the end of every podcast, I like to read a little quote. And I know we kind of talked about the last part of your book that I wanted to read to our listeners today. And, basically, it's just kind of a final word from yourself about the book. So I'm going to read the last two paragraphs really quick. So if parts of this book resonated with you and other parts didn't connect, that's okay. Take what is useful to you and leave the rest. Gaslighting relationships are diverse and have varying levels of impact depending upon the type, timing, and duration of the relationship. Consequently, your experiences and recovery process may vary. You are unique and your journey is your own. Know that you are worthy of love and respect. Any experience or message that told you otherwise was a lie. Hold on tightly to this truth. Let it guide you forward as you seek out and build the life you desire.
Yeah.
Deborah, thank you so much for this podcast. I think it was this is probably gonna be one of my favorite episodes to go back and listen to, honestly.
Oh, well, it's been a pleasure chatting with you today.
Yeah, where can the listeners find you at on socials?
Sure. You can find me on Instagram at traumatherapydoc. Also on TikTok, same handle. I'm on Facebook under my business name, so that's facebook.com Tamar Counseling Services. And oh, I'm just about everywhere you can find people. Pinterest, LinkedIn, all those ones are kind of boring though. So
And just for the people that do listen to on YouTube, here's the book. It's called Gaslighting. It's by Dr. Deborah Vinall. I hope I didn't butcher that last name.
that
Okay.
sounds good.
Thank you guys all so very much for listening. And Deborah, thank you again so much for being a guest on this podcast. For all my listeners, be well and always remember, be gentle with yourselves. Till next time, take care.